Hey everyone, ready to dive into something really fascinating in the world of finance? We're going to be unpacking central bank digital currencies, those CBDCs everyone's talking about, and exploring some really interesting ideas about what money could look like down the road.
We're going deep on this one, looking at a recent video by Levi featuring investigative journalist Whitney Webb. She gets into some eye-opening stuff about where CBDCs might lead us.
Yeah, and this isn't just your typical financial jargon either. They were talking about a two-tier CBDC system. Is that like, I don't know, the economy having a VIP section that most people don't even know about?
Well, you could think of it that way. It's more about how these systems might actually work in practice. You see, there's a distinction between what are called wholesale and retail CBDCs. So wholesale CBDCs, those mainly just facilitate transactions between big players, central banks, and financial institutions. The retail kind, those are the ones that would directly impact you and me, like digital cash issued by central banks that we'd use day to day.
So some politicians, they say they oppose CBDCs. Maybe they're really just worried about that digital cash in your pocket version.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. They might be perfectly fine with the whole behind-the-scenes wholesale model, but when it comes to central banks issuing digital cash directly to the public, that's where they draw the line. See, even without issuing a single digital dollar to individuals, this two-tier system could still give central banks a huge amount of control over the entire financial system.
Which makes that whole statement from Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, even more interesting. You don't hear a banking giant casually mention seizing private property every day.
Right. His statement suggesting that private property could potentially be seized, and this was in the context of climate change policies, that really got people talking. It makes you wonder, in a world where we're more and more reliant on digital transactions, how much control could actually be exerted.
It's a little unnerving when you think about it.
Right.
What if someday you're denied access to your own funds just because you don't have a good enough carbon footprint score or something?
It really highlights why it's so important to carefully think through what these systems could mean, all the implications. Sure, proponents might talk about the benefits like reducing crime or making financial systems more inclusive, but we can't just ignore that potential for control and surveillance.
Yeah, and this isn't some fringe theory either. We've got big names like Mark Carney, formerly of Goldman Sachs, the Bank of England, and now Bloomberg, talking about a whole new global financial order.
And Carney's been pretty vocal about the need for a new system. He's talked about multipolar currencies. Basically, imagine multiple dominant currencies, maybe including CBDCs, backed by China or other major economies. Oh, and he also points to global carbon markets as a key element.
Global carbon markets.
hmm
Now that sounds like a whole other rabbit hole for us to dive into sometime.
It's all connected to this idea of, get this, tokenizing everything. Imagine a world where it's not just money that's digital, but natural resources are on a blockchain. Heck, even individual identities would be tokenized.
Hold on, tokenizing people. Does that mean someday I'll need to put my carbon footprint score on my resume?
Well, the idea is that using digital IDs and blockchain, you'd basically create a record of everything on a digital ledger. So yeah, your digital ID could potentially be linked to your carbon footprint, among other things.
Okay, now we're getting into some real sci-fi territory. Are we talking about a future where people are denied access to financial services or even the ability to travel just because of some digital score?
It's a question worth asking, for sure. Now, those who support this kind of thing, they say it's all about efficiency, transparency, security, that sort of thing. But you can't deny the potential impact on our privacy and autonomy. That's huge.
It is a lot to process, that's for sure. So if this new system hinges on CBDCs, digital IDs, global carbon markets, how would something like that even come about? What could be the catalyst?
That's the million-dollar question. Some people are saying that what we need is a major global event, something big. Think a massive financial meltdown, a cyber attack that cripples infrastructure, another pandemic even worse than the last one, or even some unprecedented climate disaster. Something like that could be used to justify a rapid shift to a new system.
So the idea is a crisis creates fear.
Yeah.
And fear makes people a lot more willing to accept solutions they might have rejected before, create the problem, then offer the prepackaged solution. Why does that sound so familiar?
It's not a new playbook, right? But in this case, that solution could hand over a lot of power and control to a very small group of people. It's natural to be concerned.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. But let's say this is the path we're headed down. Are there any alternatives? Can regular people, individuals, actually do anything to protect themselves in this kind of system? Got to be some glimmer of hope here, right?
Oh, there's always hope, don't worry. And a big part of that is simply knowing what's going on, right? You're trying to navigate something as potentially complex as the future of finance. Information is key.
Absolutely, yeah. Burying our heads in the sand isn't going to help anybody. So you mentioned alternatives to this whole centralized system. What did you have in mind?
Well, the video points to cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin in particular, as a possible alternative. Because they operate independently of governments and central banks, cryptocurrencies are inherently much harder to control in the ways we've been discussing.
Bitcoin, that's the one everyone calls digital gold, right?
Yeah.
But is it really a viable alternative to the entire financial system as we know it? Like, can I actually buy groceries with Bitcoin yet?
Well, it's still early days for crypto. I mean, it definitely has its own set of challenges. For one thing, the value can be very volatile, and it's certainly not as simple as just, swapping every dollar for a Bitcoin. But that decentralized nature of it, that's attracting a lot of attention, especially from people who are concerned about the possibility of centralized systems overreaching.
Okay, so it's not a magic bullet, but it's something worth understanding. What's important for people to know if they're curious about getting started with crypto? Should we all be rushing out to buy some right now?
I'd say never rush into anything without doing your research first. Make sure you understand how cryptocurrencies work, what kind of technology underpins them, what the risks are, and yeah, the potential rewards too, of course. And I always say diversification is key, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket, whether we're talking stocks, bonds, real estate, crypto, whatever.
It's like they say, don't invest more than you can afford to lose,
Mm.
especially with something as new and kind of wild as cryptocurrency still is.
Exactly. And it's not just about picking the right investment either. It's about really taking control of your financial future, understanding all the forces at play and being able to make decisions from a place of knowledge, not just, I don't know, blind faith. The more you know, the better prepared you are, no matter what happens.
So being proactive, not passive, not just hoping everything will work out, but understanding all the possibilities and then making choices that actually align with, our own personal values.
100%. Question everything, think critically, and don't be afraid to take control of your own financial well-being.
Oh, that's empowering. Speaking of control, though, this video mentions something called natural asset corporations. It kind of sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. Are we talking about corporations owning, like, actual nature now?
Yeah, that's a concept that's generating a lot of discussion, that's for sure. The way they described it in the video, it's essentially putting a price tag on nature. So let's say you've got a rainforest, right? They would identify that as a natural asset and then issue shares in that asset, which could then be traded on financial
So
markets.
instead of worrying about how much my coffee costs, now I got to worry about the price of the rainforest it came from.
It's a complicated issue. Those who support it, they argue that this could actually incentivize conservation and environmental protection. The thinking is, by creating a financial incentive to preserve these natural assets, by making them literally valuable, then corporations, investors would be more likely to protect them.
Okay, that sounds kind of nice on the surface, but it seems like something that could easily backfire. If the goal is ultimately profit, how do we prevent these corporations from just, I don't know, exploiting nature even more for their own financial gain? What's to stop them from saying, well, this rainforest is worth more if we cut down half the trees and sell the lumber?
That's the big question, right? It's a valid concern for sure, and it really highlights the need for strong, robust regulations and oversight mechanisms, to make sure that any system like that actually prioritizes the environment, that it puts environmental well-being and social responsibility ahead of short-term profits, which, let's face it, is often a challenge.
Yeah, because it feels like once you put a price tag on something like a rainforest, it changes how we view it. Like suddenly there's a dollar sign hanging over every tree in the Amazon.
And speaking of keeping track of things, the video also mentioned this, like universal ledger, where every single transaction is tracked. That's a little unnerving, to say the least.
It is, and it all ties into this bigger trend. We're seeing more and more data collection, more surveillance. The more digital our lives become, the more all our actions, our transactions, even just our everyday interactions are being tracked, recorded somewhere, which of course raises some very important questions about privacy, control, who has access to all this data.
And what they might be doing with it. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where this kind of information is used for all the wrong reasons, or where individuals are, I don't know, penalized or excluded based on their digital footprint. It really underscores why it's so important to be aware of the potential downsides. These technologies, they might offer convenience, maybe some efficiency, but they always come with trade-offs. We have to be aware of those trade-offs, and we have to be willing to fight for safeguards to protect our privacy, our freedoms.
So it's not enough to just cross our fingers and hope for the best. We have to be informed, we have to be engaged, and maybe even a little bit, I don't know, assertive about shaping the rules of the game. With all this talk about a new financial system, digital IDs, global carbon markets, what are some of the red flags we should be looking out for?
One red flag that immediately comes to mind is any attempt to rush through the implementation of this kind of technology, especially without a proper public debate, without transparency, without really considering all the potential consequences. That's a huge warning sign.
Like using a crisis, real or manufactured, to justify a power grab.
Exactly. Another red flag to watch out for is any system that concentrates too much power in the hands of one central authority, whether it's the government, a corporation, a tech giant, doesn't matter.
So be wary of anything that centralizes power instead of distributing it, where the solution seems like it would benefit a select few at the expense of everyone else.
You got it. And be very, very careful of anyone who comes along claiming to have all the answers or promises some kind of utopian future. Those just don't exist. There are always trade-offs, and it's up to us to weigh those trade-offs carefully and decide what we're willing to live with, what we're willing to accept.
It's like they say, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. There's no such thing as a free lunch, especially when it comes to something as crucial as our financial system, the very foundation of our society. But realistically, what can the average person actually do about all of this? It feels pretty overwhelming sometimes.
It's totally understandable to feel that way, but I think we need to remember that being informed, being engaged, being vocal, that's powerful in itself. We can start by simply educating ourselves and others about these issues. We can support organizations that are out there fighting for financial transparency and individual rights, and we can hold our elected officials accountable. Let them know we expect them to prioritize people, not powerful corporations or institutions.
So it's not about admitting defeat, it's about recognizing that we do have power. As individuals and as a collective, it's about speaking up, demanding transparency, holding those in power accountable.
Yes. And that brings us back to those potential trigger events they mentioned in the video, right? A major financial crisis, a cyber attack that cripples our infrastructure, a pandemic even more severe than the one we just went through, a climate disaster of unprecedented scale.
So basically anything that creates widespread fear and uncertainty. The kind of situation where people are more willing to accept radical solutions they might have rejected before.
It's an unfortunate pattern, but it's one we've seen repeated throughout history. When people are afraid, they're more likely to give up their freedoms in exchange for a promise of security, even if that promise comes at a very steep price.
Which is why it's even more important to be aware of these tactics, to be prepared mentally, practically, for different scenarios, to have a plan just in case.
Having a plan B, that's crucial. Knowing what you would do, where you would go, how you would protect yourself and your family if the worst happened. Think of it like having an emergency preparedness kit, but for your finances, for your freedom.
So it's about having options, having a safety net, knowing how to maintain at least some level of autonomy in a world that seems increasingly unpredictable, potentially even hostile to individual liberty.
Exactly. It's about being prepared, not paranoid. Empowering ourselves with knowledge and taking steps to safeguard our well-being without giving in to fear.
That's a really important distinction, being prepared, not panicked. But there's so much information out there, especially in the age of social media and instant news. How do we even know what to believe? It can be hard to separate fact from fiction sometimes.
You're not wrong. It's more important now than ever to be discerning about the information we consume. Don't just accept everything you read or hear at face value, even if it comes from a source you generally trust. Cross-reference information, consider the source, think about their potential biases, and be very wary of anyone claiming to have all the answers.
That's about cultivating media literacy.
Right.
Right, being able to look at information from any source and critically evaluate it, thinking for ourselves.
Exactly. We can't just outsource our critical thinking to algorithms or talking heads on TV. We have to engage our own minds, we have to ask questions, and we cannot be afraid to challenge assumptions.
Now, something I thought was interesting, the video we're discussing, they actually mentioned Bloomberg, which is interesting because Mark Carney, one of the big voices pushing for this new financial system, he's the chairman of Bloomberg now.
That's definitely worth noting. It shows how important it is to really understand the media landscape. Who owns and controls the information we consume, and what are their motivations?
Follow the money, right.
Yeah.
If we understand who stands to benefit from a particular narrative, it helps us to look at that narrative with a more critical eye.
100%. We have to be aware of potential conflicts of interest, hidden agendas, attempts to manipulate public opinion.
So it's not about being distrustful of everything. It's more about approaching information thoughtfully and critically.
Exactly. And a big part of that is being open to considering multiple perspectives, even or maybe especially viewpoints we might not initially agree with.
Getting out of our echo chambers, exposing ourselves to a diversity of viewpoints.
Yes. It's often in those spaces of intellectual friction where different ideas collide that we find the most valuable insights.
It's about nuance. Understanding that these complex issues, they rarely have simple solutions. And being open to learning from people who see things differently than we do.
Well said. It's about having respectful dialogue, even when we disagree, and recognizing that we all have something to learn from each other.
So let's circle back to this whole tokenizing everything concept for a minute. We've talked about it in the context of people, natural resources, but this video seems to suggest a much broader application of this technology. They mentioned Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, talking about a future where basically everything has a unique identifier on a universal ledger.
It's like a world where every product you buy, every piece of property you own, maybe even every interaction you have is recorded and tracked on a digital ledger. Now, of course, they say this would make everything more efficient, more transparent, more secure.
And while that might sound great at first, I can't help but think about the potential for this kind of technology to be misused. What does it mean for our privacy and autonomy if our every move, every purchase, even just our everyday interactions are cataloged and potentially analyzed by someone?
It's a valid concern. Imagine a world where whether you have access to certain goods and services, your ability to travel, maybe even your job opportunities, are all determined by some algorithm that's constantly assessing your digital footprint.
It sounds incredibly invasive, like something out of a dystopian sci-fi movie where every aspect of our lives is monitored and controlled by unseen forces.
And that's precisely why we need to be having these conversations now. Before these technologies become so deeply embedded in our lives that it's too late to change course, we need to be thinking about the potential consequences, the good, the bad, the unintended, and putting safeguards in place to protect our fundamental rights and freedoms.
Because technology in itself, it's not inherently good or bad, right? It's all about how we choose to use it, how we allow it to shape our world.
You got it. And that choice, how we develop, how we deploy, how we regulate these powerful technologies, that's what will determine what the future looks like. And it's not a choice we can afford to get wrong.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the technical details of how CBDCs work to the bigger philosophical implications of this idea of tokenizing everything. It's a lot to process, and I'm sure some of our listeners are feeling a little overwhelmed right now, maybe even a little anxious.
It's understandable to feel that way, absolutely. But I think the most important thing to remember is that knowledge is power. The more we understand about these technologies, about what's driving their development, about how they might impact our lives, the better prepared we'll be to face whatever the future holds and to advocate for the kind of world we want to live in.
So it's not about being afraid or in denial. It's about approaching these challenges with our eyes wide open, thinking critically, being willing to have these difficult conversations, even when they're uncomfortable.
Exactly. We need to remember that we have a voice, we have agency, and the future isn't predetermined. We have the power to shape it.
And a big part of shaping that future is simply staying informed and engaged. So for our listeners who are feeling motivated to learn more, what are some ways they can keep up to date on these complex, constantly evolving issues?
That's a great question. When it comes to understanding finance, it's so important to seek out diverse perspectives. Do your own research. Don't just take one person's word for it.
Don't just take our word for it either, right? Look for credible sources, cross-reference information, be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers, because the reality is nobody does.
Exactly. And always remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about how the financial system works, the better equipped you'll be to navigate it yourself and make informed decisions about your own financial future.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves from potential threats, it's about understanding how to thrive in a world that's changing faster than ever before.
Absolutely. It's about taking control of our own destinies and working together to create a future where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
Now that's a future I can get behind.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom when we start talking about these big systemic issues. But I don't know, for me, it always helps to remember that we're not just helpless bystanders here. We actually have a say in how this all plays out.
Absolutely. Every choice we make, every action we take, it creates ripples. We might not each have control over the global financial system as individuals, but we can definitely control how we participate in it, how we educate ourselves, how we use our voices to advocate for a better future, a more just and equitable future for everyone.
It's about recognizing our own agency, not just as individuals, but as a collective. We have the power to choose to be informed, to ask the tough questions, to support the organizations and initiatives that align with our values, and to hold those in power accountable for their actions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We don't have to be passive bystanders in all of this. We can choose to be active participants, shaping the narrative through the choices we make every day, through our voices, through our actions, big or small.
It's about taking responsibility,
Mm.
right? Not just for ourselves and our own financial well-being, but also for the kind of world we want to leave behind, for our kids, for future generations. That's what it all comes down to.
And that's a perfect segue into a crucial point I want to make as we start to wrap up our deep dive into the future of finance. The question isn't just about protecting ourselves, it's about proactively creating a future that actually reflects what we value, a future we can be proud of.
So if someone's listening to this right now, feeling inspired, maybe even a little fired up, what's one concrete action they can take today to feel more empowered in the face of all this?
Sometimes the simplest actions are the most powerful. Start by having conversations about these issues. Talk to your family, your friends, your communities, share what you're learning. Knowledge is amplified when it's shared, right? Explore different perspectives, challenge your own assumptions, be open to learning from people who see things differently than you do. You never know what insights might emerge.
It's all about nurturing that curiosity, embracing the nuances, and engaging in respectful dialogue, especially when we disagree, because that's often where the real learning happens.
Exactly. And don't underestimate those small, everyday actions. Supporting organizations that are doing good work, fighting for financial transparency, sustainable practices, individual rights, that can have a huge ripple effect. Every little bit counts.
Every choice we make, from the brands we support to the policies we advocate for, it all adds up. We're all contributing to the world we're creating, whether we realize it or not.
It's about aligning our actions with our values and recognizing that we all have a part to play in this. Building a more just and equitable future is a team effort.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a sense of hope, of possibility, and most importantly, agency. The future of finance, just like the future in general, it's not set in stone. It's a story that's still being written. And we all have the power to pick up a pen and contribute to a more just and equitable chapter.
Keep asking those tough questions. Keep challenging assumptions. Keep demanding transparency. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never forget the future is ours to create.
Until